Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm James Nelson with Cushman & Wakefield. I know this is going to be about the new 421A plan, but I'm dangerous when I get a microphone, and I could not help at least do a couple slides on the market. I'm not going to go over the typical 30, 40-page deck and bore you about the office leasing market. I'm really going to dive in and talk about what has happened to the sales market, and then we're going to talk about specifically what happened to the land sale market, because, again, I think that will really help set the stage of what we're seeing here. So if I can get this to advance, or maybe Jelani. Okay, perfect. We get asked the question all the time from our friends, clients, how's the market? James, are you busy? And my answer is my team is always busy. We were busy in 2009. When there was 90% less transactions than '07. The question is, are we busy talking about the market, or are we busy helping our clients get contracts signed? Well, I will tell you, the last 6 months, we've been very busy, but unfortunately, it's been mostly doing a lot of talking, okay? And I think should not be a surprise to you all that leading up to the election, a lot of the investors were saying, we're gonna wait, I'm gonna be on the sidelines and wait to see where things go. We were optimistic that people were going to come back in the new year, and they came back to the table. We had waves of investors, developers coming back saying, look, we're interested in seeing opportunities. We launched with a couple new exciting projects, a lot of packages being requested, a lot of tours, offers, but still we talk about this bid-ask spread. And I've got to say that a lot of our client sellers, they're reading the papers too. A lot of them have come down on their price and expectations. But the buyers really, over the last couple of months, there has not been urgency in the market. A lot of the buyers are thinking, well, if I wait, interest rates have gone up. There's been some cap rate expansion. We know how challenging retail has been, for example. And a lot of buyers out there, I believe, say, well, look, if we wait, then hopefully pricing will come down in my favor, and we'll take advantage of that. Well, I think that tide is about to turn, because we're seeing, maybe not in all segments of the market, so whenever we talk about how's the market, we have to speak, okay, well, what neighborhood, what business plan? But I can say we are seeing a lot of signs of life, and what you'll see, though, is that the effects of the last 6 months. And the one thing I do want to caution you before we go over these stats is that sales reports are always rearview mirror, right? Because if a sale, when we report sales, that is a result of a transaction that was likely negotiated 6 to 9 months ago, and you have to wait for that transfer to come through. So the better leading indicator is, James, how many contracts is your team signing? And I can tell you that on average, our team closes about 40 transactions a year. That means we need to sign 3 or 4 contracts a month to keep the machine going. In the first quarter of this year, we signed 1 contract, so that was not great. In the last 2 weeks, we've signed, David, is it 3, 4 contracts? 3, okay. We're working on 4, hopefully by early next week. But so this is, so again, we do think that activity's picking up, but if you look at the results of the last couple months, 2017, 51% drop in the number of dollar volume if you annualize it against last year. Last year was down 25% from the peak of the market in 2015. Again, 2015, $77 billion, all-time high, so we need to keep things in perspective. But number of properties sold, down 23%. Dollar volume per property, down 37%. We had only $1 billion plus transaction in the first quarter of the year. Average price per Manhattan, slightly up. Average price in the boroughs, up 5%. So you might say, well, James, the market is slowing down. Why are prices holding? Why are prices going up? Well, this is common for us to see. When you see a drop in volume, what happens is that sellers who do not get their prices don't sell. Unless, of course, if they're forced to. We certainly haven't seen that yet. So we are seeing pricing holding, even inching up in some categories, but I don't believe that this type of pricing is sustainable if the activity is not there. So again, that's why the key is really to get things to pick up again. That being said, land sale prices citywide down 9%. I don't think that will surprise any of you at all. If you look at historically what has happened in the sale market, you see the peak at $77 billion in 2015, and then you see last year's 57, and then we're on pace for, I can barely read that, was that 38 billion, I believe? 28, okay, even less, okay. And then you have the number of properties sold. You know, the amazing thing here is in New York City, where there is over 250,000 buildings, only about 5,000 of them sell per year. So if you bought a building last year, congratulations. You were one of the few. Only about 2 to 3% of the inventory turns over. So it is technically always a seller's market because there's so little inventory, and there's always going to be more buyers than sellers. If you look at the development metrics, and we just talked about how overall dollar volume was down 51% citywide, no surprise that the land sale volume was down 61%, so far less sales. And only, actually I'll go back there, only $2.5 billion of sales. If you annualize what took place in the first quarter, there's only going to be 288 pieces of land that will sell compared to 2015 when there were 629 sites which sold. If you look at Manhattan, again, 2015, 119 sites that sold, we're on pace to do 64 sites. That's really not that much land that will sell. And so I guess the good news for those of you who might be concerned with whether it's too much rental inventory in Brooklyn, whether it's too much condo product in Manhattan, we're going to have a real void in the next 2 or 3 years. You're going to look around, you're going to say, where's all the new development, right? Because so little land sold last year. And we can certainly attribute that to a lack of financing, right? The conventional lenders dropped out. Well, and you talk to any developer out there, they say, everyone says Bank of Ozarks. That's the first, everyone's talking about Bank of Ozarks. I've got a good friend, a mortgage broker, who tells me that there's plenty more to lend, so I guess that's the good news. But the private lenders, those who have figured out how to structure these deals to get developers more leverage, I think that has made these developments possible. Also, if you look at the quote-unquote affordable condo market under $3 million, my residential broker friends will tell me there's only a 2 or 3 month supply. It's really the $10 million plus product that is, if you look, it's really a 7-8 year supply of condos that are on the market. But guess what? There's only about 100 $10 million plus apartments that sell every year anyways. It's a very small segment of the market. It ends up on the cover of the New York Post. It's popular to talk about, but the reality is that the $3 million and under is still moving. But lastly, and what we're here to speak to today, is the lack of the 421A program, and that really, especially in the boroughs, was what decimated the land sale value. So we're about to change that, about to get things heated up. And again, you look at what has gone on with development site sale activity, dollar volume, number of sales. In the peak of the market, 14 billion of trades, over 1,000 pieces of land that sold. So that's really this enormous pipeline that's come out of 2015. But again, you look at what happened last year, you look at what may happen this year, although we're hoping that's going to pick back up. Again, I think the play today, and it's almost counterintuitive, is really to pursue these development opportunities. So hopefully that helps set the stage. And Jonathan, if you can help kick us off, it'd be great to hear from you all.
Great. Have to figure out how to use this mic. Well, let me begin by welcoming everybody to our home this morning. And James, thank you for inviting all of your friends, colleagues. It's great to see so many people, many of whom we've represented you. We've been on the opposite side of you. I hope we haven't sued you, but it's great to see so many faces. And let me begin by saying, I think collectively, what everybody's been waiting for is what is going to happen. I think for the last, I don't know how many months, James, we've had this conversation. When is this program going to come out? And Michael, needless to say, I think your phone has been ringing constantly, and Jen, we've been talking about this internally, is what's going to happen with 421A? Will it happen? Will it not happen? Will the state legislature agree on it? What are the political forces? And so, needless to say, it's been a long wait, and only time will tell the impact it'll have on the market and the impact it'll have on all of our transactions. But the one thing that we can say for sure right now is that there's an element of certainty, and the question is, how all of us in the industry are going to absorb the changes in the program and the impact that it's going to have on the market. It's really, as looking at the statistics that James just shared with us, there's no question that it's coming out at a very interesting time in the market, and it will clearly have an influence on it. And I think maybe it'll be exciting, James. Why don't I put this out? Maybe we should all convene in 6 to 8 months and talk about the impact and the way the program really looks. So let's I think it's time to let's dive into the program. On my immediate left is my friend and colleague, Jen Dixon. Jen is our Chief Zoning and Development Specialist here at Herrick Feinstein. Jen's practice involves all aspects of development in the 5 boroughs, ranging from the 421A to landmarks to figuring out what you can build, what you can't build, how high it can go, how do we change the zoning, how do we go to the city, how do we deal with anything that deals with dirt on a piece of land in the 5 boroughs. Jen and I have worked together for how many years, Jen, has it been? How many years have you been? 13 years. So we were both in high school when we started working here. Needless to say, today is just the beginning of a process. So Jen's going to give us a lot of information this morning, and by all means, don't hesitate to follow up afterwards. To my right is Mike Slattery, who is a friend and a colleague, and really, I think everyone collectively owes a great debt of gratitude to Rebney and to Mike in particular for pushing this through. I'm sure the war stories of what took place in Albany, I don't know if you're allowed to talk about it, but I'm sure the Post will cover it in due time. Mike really has been instrumental in putting this program together. So this morning, Jen and Michael will put together a program. They'll split the discussion to 2 areas, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments, and we'll go from there. So let me turn the floor over to Jen right now, and we'll begin.
Thank you. Good morning. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the program. I'm going to talk about ways that the program has changed from the previous version of 421A, and then talk about some differences in the program. And then Mike will continue to talk about some differences that we all need to be aware of, and also focus on some of the construction labor provisions. So the first thing that we all need to know is that the program has been renamed. It's now called Affordable New York. We all still refer to it as 421A, so I will probably use those terms interchangeably, although I'll try to be clear about whether I'm talking about the previous version or the current version of the program. It's a state law. So the New York State Legislature passed this program in last month, April of 2017. It's a program that's administered by the city, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. They generally pass rules that go along with the statute that guide us through the program. They have not done that yet for this current version of the program, so we're going to be talking primarily today about what the statute says, which really covers the entirety of the program. So what is it? What are we talking about? We're talking about a tax exemption, a real property tax exemption for new residential multiple dwellings. This is for buildings that have 6 or more units. And what it does is that it freezes the assessed value of a property prior to the year of commencement of construction, so that any increase in assessed value that's attributable to the new building, the new residential building that's developed on the property, will not be taxed during the period of exemption. So the land value will go up, but the building value will stay as it was prior during that exemption period. And then the length depends on, we'll get into more details on that, but the length depends on where you are and what you're doing in the program. For the current iteration, you must have commenced construction after December 31st, 2015. So that's when the prior version of the program expired. And you must commence before June 15th, 2022. You must complete construction by June 15th of 2026. So just a little bit of history about the program and how we got to where we are today. It was originally created in 1971 to encourage the development of multifamily housing. Through the years, it has evolved quite a bit, reflecting changes in both the real estate market and also the political climate. Significant changes were made to the program in the 1980s to create the geographic exclusion area, which is an area in Manhattan at the time where affordable housing was required in order to be eligible. Prior to that, that was not a requirement. At that time, the certificate program was also created, so you could do affordable housing off-site and use certificates from another property in the city. Significant changes were then made in 2007, which required affordable housing in more areas, so it expanded that geographic area to other areas of the city, and also benefits were decreased to a certain extent. As we all know, I think the program expired in December of 2015. It was renewed last month, as I just mentioned, and now it is called the Affordable New York Program. So just a few words about if you were under that prior program. So if a property commenced construction, meaning that it actually started work on the new building pursuant to a legal building permit or any kind of permit that allows you to commence construction, then you would be vested under the 2015 421A program. There is an option to opt in to the new program if you have not received benefits pursuant to that old program. So if the Department of Finance actually hasn't received your certificate of eligibility and implemented benefits, and you think that you can meet the requirements of the new program moving forward, then you can choose to opt in. Otherwise, if you commence construction, at that point in time, you would be vested. So just a few words about what vested projects are subject to under the prior 421A 2015 program. There is what's called an exemption cap for properties that don't include affordable housing. This is something that was implemented in 2007. It started at a cap of $65,000 of assessed value per unit, and it's gone up by 3% per year, so it's at about $84,000 today, meaning that any portion of your assessed value over that would be subject to full tax, and it is not part of the tax exemption. Buildings that are under the older program are also subject to a prevailing wage requirement for building service employees, people who work in the building. This doesn't have anything to do with construction, and that is for buildings that have 50 or more units. There are also affordable housing requirements under that previous version of the program. Again, these are for buildings that are in that specific geographic exclusion area, which is all of Manhattan and portions of the other boroughs. If you are one of those properties, you can satisfy your requirements on-site or off-site if you happen to have certificates still. If you're doing your affordable housing on-site under that program, you need to do 20% of your units as affordable at a level of 60% of area median income or AMI. So moving right into the new Affordable New York version of 421A, what has stayed the same between the two programs? First of all, the calculation of the tax exemption. It still works in the same way. You're still looking at your AV prior to the year that you commence construction, and that's still the so-called mini tax that will be used moving forward in order to form the basis for your tax exemption. So then anything that is attributable, any increase that's attributable to the new building will not be taxed or will be subject to the exemption. You still get a 3-year construction exemption. So during the period that the building is under construction, that exemption runs years 1 through 3, and then the full length of the actual tax exemption will start after that. There's still a limitation for non-residential and accessory residential space of 12%. So if you have a little bit of commercial or tenant amenity space, it will fall into that category. If you're below 12%, it will be fully covered by the tax exemption. If you go over that, it will be fully taxed. There's still a prevailing wage requirement for building service employees, people who work in the building. This requirement is now applicable to buildings that have 30 units or more, so it is a smaller size building that is subject to that requirement. And rent stabilization is still required at the outset of the program for rental buildings, which are primarily the basis for what this program is now. So you still have to enter your units into rent stabilization. So just to talk about the length of the tax exemption, that has changed, and it's a little bit simpler than it was under the prior program. So under the prior program, you had a few different categories of length of tax exemption depending on where you were and whether you had affordable housing on site or not. There was also a phase-out period in the prior program, so you'd have your full tax exemption for a certain number of years, and then it would start to reduce by 20% every year or every 2 years, depending on where you were. Now there are less options for that. So for basic rental projects, you get a 35-year tax exemption. That's 25 years at 100%, so it's 100% tax exemption. And then the next 10 years, you get an exemption at a percentage that's equivalent to the amount of affordability that you have in your building. So if 25% of your units are affordable, then you get a 25% tax exemption. Anything above that is subject to full taxes for those last 10 years. Home ownership projects, which are more limited under the new program, actually quite limited under the new program, get a 20-year tax exemption. They get 14 years at 100%, and then 6 years at a 25% tax exemption. And enhanced affordability projects, which are those projects that have 300 or more units and are subject to the construction labor requirements based on their location in the city, which Mike will talk more about, get a 35-year tax exemption at 100%. So they get that full 100% tax exemption for 35 years. Affordable rental projects, affordable rental units in those projects must remain rent stabilized for 40 years. The affordability requirements, those have changed as well. So whereas the tax exemption maybe the length became a little bit simpler, now we have more options for affordability that you're looking at, and you have a choice for rental projects as to which affordability tier you would like to utilize. These requirements are mandatory in order to be eligible for the program. So for basic rental projects, there are 3 affordability options. Option A requires that 25% of the total units in the building are affordable, 10% at 40% of AMI, 10% at 60% of AMI, and 5% at 130% of AMI. And those are maximum levels. You could have units that have a deeper affordability than that. Under this option A, you're permitted to use tax-exempt bonds and low-income housing tax credits, but not any other form of government subsidy. Option B requires 30% of the units as affordable, 10% at 70% of AMI, and 20% at 130% of AMI. And option C is another 30% option, but it's a higher income option. All 30% of those units can be affordable at 130% of AMI. The option is not permitted south of 96th Street in Manhattan, and you're also not permitted to use government subsidy under this option. There are also options for the enhanced affordability projects, those that are subject to construction labor requirements. These are almost identical to the previous options for the basic rental projects. So here they are, but they're very similar. There's 3 options again. And then we have the home ownership option, which is referred to as option D in the statute. This is not permitted in Manhattan. Projects must have an average assessed value of $65,000 per unit at completion in order to be eligible at all. You can have a max of 35 units in such a project, and if you meet these eligibility requirements, benefits are subject to an AV cap of $65,000 per unit. So I'm just going to quickly run through a few more changes before Mike talks about some of the other elements of the program. Affordable and market rate units, when they're in the same building, must share common entrances and common areas. This is similar to the city's mandatory inclusionary requirement, but not exactly the same. Affordable units generally must be on site in this program. There's no certificate program here where you can purchase certificates from somebody. The minimum number of units has changed from the prior program. It was originally 3 units, then it was 4, and now there's a minimum of 6 units that you must have in order to be eligible. As mentioned, there are construction labor requirements, and there is a change to the rent stabilization requirements as well, specifically relating to market rate units. There does seem to be a little bit of ambiguity around this, but the statute does say that market rate units can be taken out of rent stabilization after, if those market rate units would otherwise be allowed to be deregulated under rent stabilization laws. So previously, it didn't matter at what rent you were at. If you were above the level at which deregulation was possible, you had to keep those market rate units stabilized for the length of the program. That has now changed. That is not no longer a requirement in the statute. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Jen. And Jonathan was kind enough not to tell you that while him and Jen were high school students, I was one of those cranky teachers in that high school. So there was a little bit of a difference here. And also, James, when he talked earlier about having 50 people there, I said, that's fine. He said, well, we got more. I said, well, union rules require that we get another presenter with me. And I could have been, we're fortunate, and I'm fortunate to really have Herrick as a partner and Jen Dixon as a partner here. So thank you guys for hosting it and participating. The Affordable New York program was extended, if you recall, by 3 additional years. The original program that was enacted in 2015 was supposed to expire in 2019. Because of the significant delay, it was important, we felt, to negotiate a longer period of benefit, in part because someone wasn't going to start a project with only 2 years left on a program, and especially given the history of the suspension that we've just experienced, no one was going to have the comfort that they're going to be able, the program is going to seamlessly roll over 3 more years. So the program was extended 3 years. We think that's a critical element in the utility of the program going forward. And also, by moving it to 2022, it unlinked the program from rent regulations. A while back, there was a desire by the Assembly to kind of link rent regulations expiration with 421A expirations so that there would be a little bit of a dynamic and a little more leverage on the industry to kind of concede on issues. By moving it to 2022, it's kind of unlinked that at this point. So the enhanced 35-year benefit, or the enhanced affordability program, has a number of requirements. One, it only applies to projects which are in Manhattan, south of 96th Street, and the 1 mile in from the Brooklyn and Queens waterfront, from the bulkhead, in Community Boards 1 and 2 in Brooklyn. And you have to be a rental project with more than 300 units. So it's 300 units or more rental, plus being in that geographic area, and then you are kind of obligated to pay the wage requirement. 2 types of projects would be exempt from that requirement. One is a project that is 50% or more affordable, or a project that has already entered into a project labor agreement with the union. And here, just a brief outline of the options that Jen had pointed out to you. The exemption runs for 35 years. You must meet the affordability requirements. But the issue about the market rate units, and Jen touched on it a little bit, the intention in the legislation was that market rate units would no longer be subject to rent regulations. And the rationale behind that change was that if we are now imposing greater affordability and deeper affordability requirements, why do we want to cap the rental income that could come from the market rate units, which were intended to cross-subsidize the low income? And it becomes even more important, as we've seen the Rent Guidelines Board in the last 3 years basically have a 0 increase. So this change is a significant one. I would point out, though, you should take a look at the language where the intention was not to have the market rate units rent regulated at all. There are those who look at the language and are not so clear that it says exactly that. And there's always the worry that a judge will read it in a way which is more favorable to the tenant than to the landlord. And again, I would advise you to see people at Herrick to kind of get some clarity on that issue. A couple of other important changes in terms of the program. One is that there used to be a provision called underutilization. So you had to meet an underutilization test. And that meant that the site, to be eligible for a 421A benefit, could not have one test would be, is the building on the site built less than half the floor area that's permitted on that site? So if it was, that site passed the test and it could be used as a 421A site. Another test, if you didn't pass that test, is the land value greater than the value of the improvements. And if it is, that would also pass the underutilization test and you could proceed. Now there is no longer an underutilization test for 421A. However, there is another provision that has been kind of resurrected called the replacement ratio. And that means that 3 years prior to construction, whatever the number of housing units that were on the site at that time, the new development must contain that many affordable units. So if you had a tenement building that was on the site and it had 10 units, your new affordable project has to have at least 10 affordable housing units. So now we talk a little bit about the wages. So if you are in Manhattan, the wage requirement is to pay $60 an hour on average for the construction workers over the entire project. It's the average wage for the entire project for the construction workers. And that wage includes not only what you pay them on the job, but also all the fringe benefits that come along with that. Vacation, payroll taxes, holiday pay, all of those things get included into the wage requirement as well as overtime pay. And the total payment that is being made on the job is then divided by the amount of hours worked to determine whether you have met that average wage requirement. As I said, it's $60 in Manhattan and it's $45 in Brooklyn and Queens. Jen touched on a little bit of the opt-in program, and that means that if you are outside that geographic area, but you have 300 or more rental units in your project, you can choose to opt in to the 35-year enhanced benefit program. One, you would obviously continue to have to meet the affordability requirements, and you would also have to meet the wage requirements. In addition, and Jen also mentioned this, you cannot, if you want to opt in, presumably those are projects that have started, maybe vested under 2015, haven't completed yet. In order to opt in, you cannot have begun receiving tax exemption benefits. So you cannot have started to receive tax exemption benefits. If you have not, you can choose to opt in, and HPD is in the process of developing an application for that and how to provide you with the information to opt in. There we go. So how do you demonstrate wage compliance? The builder then has to hire what's called an independent monitor who must be a licensed CPA. On the construction side, contractors and subcontractors are required to submit within 90 days of completion of their portion of the work a certified payroll report to the independent monitor. Every week that is delayed, the contractor or subcontractor is subject to a fine of $1,000 a week, up to a maximum of $75,000. Upon completion of construction, the independent monitor has 1 year to submit to the fiscal officer, who is the controller of the City of New York, basically a report showing that the project was or was not in compliance. Again, if the independent monitor fails to meet that 1 year deadline, the project is subject to a penalty of $1,000 a week, up to a maximum of $75,000. So you can either comply and you meet the requirements, or you miss it. And you can miss it by a little, or you can miss it by a lot. A little is missing it by less than 15%. If you do that, you then have to pay the balance of that shortfall to the fiscal officer. And that has to be paid within, the payments are made to a third-party administrator. The payment has to be made within 120 days from the time that the filing is made to the fiscal officer, city's fiscal officer. If you are more than 15% short on your payroll requirement, you've missed it by more than 15%, the balance gets paid to the third-party administrator, and then you are also subject to a penalty of 25% of the shortfall. All penalties, including the shortfall penalty, gets paid to HPD for affordable housing projects. The only exception to a penalty is if there was some job action on the site. Walk out, some kind of job action that causes a delay in construction, and you would no longer be subject to that penalty. And lastly, just a few other highlights about the new program. One, It's a single application that gets filed 1 year after construction. That's the requirement, has to be filed 1 year. As you know now, there's a two-step filing process. One, a preliminary certificate that's filed, and a final certificate. Filing fee has changed from 0.4% of total project cost to $3,000 per unit. And lastly, this is the most critical thing, if you fail to pay or fail to meet the wage requirement, you cannot lose tax exemption benefits. Tax exemption benefits cannot be rescinded for failure to meet the wage requirement. So, and for us, that was a critical element because, one, we were moving into a new area. One, didn't know how this was going to work out, and no one thought that you could get financing if the project was subject to that kind of penalty for failure to meet the wage requirement. So that's just a quick overview of the project program. Happy to take any questions.